of the slides are actually coming from the lecture given by Surdip Pol. That part is related to here. So it is about international trade. Some of the slides I borrowed from Surdip, who actually had taught something about international trade. So I borrowed a partial of his lecture, but these are the slides that so Surdip Pol has been the world champion of 2020, is that 2022 WEDC, and also the champion of Australs 2022 as well. Okay, now let me start. A lot of the things that I'm going to cover in this lecture is actually about the stock arguments. So these have been arguments that have been applicable to motions that are related to economics. So many of them are quietly accessible whenever that topics are related or the debate motions are having things to do with economics or operations of business or about international trade. So a lot of these stock arguments can actually be reused, but remember almost every motion differs. That is why that try to be very careful in the analysis and what part of the analysis is applicable to some specific emotions. Okay, so we'll try to go through the first slide. Can I ask any questions how to understand defense for self-interest when we talk about economics? So the basic idea is actually about that being self-interested in the market mechanism or in the market economy is something that is very good. Can I have any response from the audience and the listeners? Anyone feel free to answer this question. Just want to have a test of how much you know about economics. Please feel free to say anything you know about the defense of self-interest. Okay, never mind. Let me try to explain myself. So being self-interested means that everyone in the market doing business or being the consumer or owner of the company or people that are working for the company, everyone is defending their own self-interest. And this is actually a pretty good thing because this is one thing for sure. And exactly because of this prediction, then the market would be then it is okay for you to try to make decisions to your own benefit, and also you'll be able to predict how other people are going to behave. So in the entire economics or the market economy, the maximization of personal interest or the maximization of the corporate interest would be something that is highly predictable. That is why, so everybody will start with certain kind of the common ground, that is try to defend their own interest. This is nothing to be ashamed of. This is never about national interest. It is actually about defending your personal interest as nothing to be shameful. This is actually pretty good because this is actually the fundamental principle that everybody is going to work and operate on. And therefore, the predictability of the market in itself is partially as a result of this self-defense of interest. Then there are other principles that work in economics that is about demand for more. When you are sufficed or you are satisfied with some current demand, then you are likely to have more demand. Demand for better goods, demand for better services, and demand for more goods. When you're sufficed with the quantity, then you may want higher quality. So these are the basic fundamental principles working in economics. Then always remember that globally we have very limited resources. That is why it is true for every government, either it is developed government or is it developing government, but things are more kind of urgent in developing countries because resources are always likely to be suffering from kind of restriction or limitation. That is why resource allocation is always likely to be a kind of analysis or partial of the analysis, especially for developing countries. The governments may have very limited sources of taxation revenue, and also the government may have very limited certain kind of international trade that they will be able to maybe having certain kind of trade surplus. That is why resource limitation has always been something that is restraining the developing government's capacity. That is why whenever we are talking about how government will be able to incapacitate certain kind of change and reform, and you always have to talk about limitation of resources or resource allocation. These are common economic motions related to welfare spending, related to government subsidies and related to almost every aspect where certain kind of the businesses are run and especially controlled by the state or especially when certain kind of economic aspects are likely to be intervened by the government. Supply and demand, these are basically certain kind of the pretty good common principle. Always remember that for every business, they would want to fight for first mover advantage because the blue sea strategy, because if you are the first mover in certain kind of market, then you are likely to enjoy higher profitability or profit margin. But when you have more competitors or rivals within the same sector or within the same field, then more likely that you have to decrease your profit margin and to try to afford a more of a cheaper pricing in order to attract more consumers. Okay, so that is why a lot of companies would like to innovate because innovation will always likely to make sure that they have the competitive edge and this kind of technology, either technological edge or certain kind of other edge in terms of better products, in terms of more advanced products or higher quality of the products offered are always likely to protect this company or make sure that company will have higher profit margin or even if the profit margin is lower but making sure that their revenue is still likely to be higher by scale economy, selling more products, having more market share, etc. Okay, always remember that there is a kind of opportunity cost, and also we have certain kind of the things like marginal thinking or whatever that is marginal utility and a marginal cost. These are basic fundamental ideas related to economics. And also, economy of scale is oftentimes used as good arguments or pieces of analysis of good arguments, especially when you are talking about certain services, then you can talk about wider scale of services is going to make sure that the company would be able to afford, would be able to offer affordable pricing because larger scale means that they would be able to maybe have decrease the unit prices of products and also they would be able to maybe be able to bear lower margin for profit, they will still be able to earn money. That is why scale economy in itself is a very good thing. And worldwide, we have globalization, a lot of MNCs in order to make sure that they have larger scale of economy. And these global MNCs would be able to monetize from, for example, they have several global research centers. Then these highly advanced technology would be transferable to other parts of production and manufacturing, and therefore they would be able to still earn money while they would be able to have global scale of production and manufacturing. And then they will also be able to have these kind of large scale globalized supply chain. They will be able to decrease their production cost and try to make sure that these scale economy would be able to make sure that they're still earning money, even if that the production cost is squeezed or depressed somehow. This is oftentimes that company would have to care about their production cost to optimize their production cost is going to make sure the company is going to earn more money. Okay, and then coming up to the second slide about some basic concepts of macroeconomics. That is in terms of how government is dealing with economics. Like there are two kinds of policies that oftentimes we'll discuss in motions related to government financial policies. The first is fiscal policy, the second is monetary policy. These are oftentimes talked about in financial crisis or in certain kind of economics or certain kind of economic context. The government policy are most likely to come to fore, like to raise attention. For example, fiscal policy are oftentimes referred to the national budget, how spending are going to be allocated. Always remember that every country would have a military spending, necessarily even larger or small, but there can be certain kind of the defense spending that is highly likely to be legitimized. And also, the state will have welfare spending, medical care, and also education. A lot of these are highly necessary in order to make sure that underprivileged people, poor people, their living costs are likely to be shouldered and covered by the state to some extent. Therefore, you do not have extreme poverty because a lot of the times that having extreme poverty is a bad story. about the government. First, it proves that this state is failing. A lot of the failing states will lose its legitimacy of governance. That is the very first reason. The second reason is that many poor people were also highly likely that the crime rate is going to be increasing. There can be a lot of the criminal gangs, and also the organized crime can be go rampant within the country, because it is easier when the state is pretty weak, when there have been rising criminal rates and crime rates, and a lot of the organized criminal gangs would be able to better recruit people who are young people and reckless people, and also risk-taking people who are willing to work for this organization in order to earn money and to maybe try to fight for a better future, even if that they know that every day they live would be their last day, but still they would still try very hard to try to venture out and to enjoy any kind of opportunity that life would be able to extend to them. I have watched and did some kind of research about crime rates in Brazil, and also in some of the Latin American countries, and also in some of the countries where drug crimes were very rampant and pretty high. So I've watched a pretty moving and touching video that is about a gangster's day. It is a kind of very in-person description, a very kind of close proximity description and of the mentality of a gangster. They were born in certain kind of the most disadvantaged sectors and also the ghetto. So life in itself is full of hardship. There is never any guarantee for food on the table within the next meal. And also many young people equally aspiring and equally want to have good life, but not any kind of possibility to enjoy life itself, not only because of hunger and the poverty, but also because of this discrimination by other people. So they are always likely to be downtrodden, always likely to be despised by people. Their personal esteem are likely to be bashed and also downtrodden pretty high. That is why this will highly increase a lot of probability for the propaganda for many of the organized crimes. So there will be many cartels and the ringleaders try to, so the recruitment or advertising for this kind of criminal gangs would be, hey, if you are living like a rat, why not just have your dog's day? So at least you'll be able to live like a king, at least for one day. So this kind of a lot of imaging about that, at least you'll be able to for one day to live like a king, to live your life. So even if this is short-lived, but still you have your day, this is highly worthwhile than risk-taking, than all kinds of possibility of imprisonment, because anyway, your life, it simply sucks. And a lot of the time that you will either you will die in hunger and poverty, or that you are anyway enjoy your life maybe for 1 month or 2 months, and then death is imminent. But still, for many people, especially for young people who could never even imagine that life could be live in that way, or they would be able to be so close and even personally enjoy a certain kind of luxury, or have the most beautiful girls to be their girlfriend, and to enjoy so many kinds of the luxury, and that they would never even try to imagine in their lifetime. Or if they live a kind of if they be a law-abiding citizens, then almost every day of their life are likely to be kind of in darkness. So by comparison, these are still good reason to encourage people to become criminals. That is why the legitimacy for our governance is try to make sure that social order will likely to be maintained, that criminal crime rates is still likely to be relatively reasonably low, and welfare spending and a lot of the education resources to citizens should still have to be guaranteed. Okay, just a bifurcation into certain kind of the stories about why criminals or organized crime can also have its attraction to poor people who have no hope in life. Okay, second is about taxation. It is actually about when businesses are booming, and the taxation rate in itself is the major source for the national income. Make sure that a nation will not be able to set really high taxation rate because all kinds of taxation rate is relative, and a lot of MNCs and the large corporations, whether they are likely to invest in your country or have their headquarters put in your country in some of the large, the first tier cities, are highly dependent on your taxation rate. For example, the year 2027, that Donald Trump, the Trump first time presidency, the Trump administration tried to change or have reform of the US taxation policy. So before 2017, the US corporate taxation rate was roughly nominally 35%. And after the actual taxation rate was about it was 30, but the actual taxation rate was about above 28 something. Then after the reform, the nominal corporate taxation rate have actually been reduced to 20. And after a lot of the deductions and certain kind of tax rebates, then the actual taxation was about 15%. This was a pretty kind of average rate, very popular rate among many of the economically advanced countries. That is why making it more attractive for corporations to be able to stay in the country. But necessarily, this kind of taxation reform, starting from the 2017, was actually being a kind of time bomb. So it actually created many problems and issues for the budgetary balance for the United States government. Because before 2017, the corporate nominal taxation rate was roughly about 25% to 30%. So at least making sure that the US taxation was at least slightly better to be able to cover up a lot of the deficits. But after the taxation reform by Donald Trump in his first administration, we have seen the gap between this deficit have been actually enlarged. And the so-called promises that the Trump taxation reform is going to bring back a lot of cash flow, which actually never happened. This is also the reason that why we are seeing the national budget or the national debt for the United States have actually been ever increasing. A few days ago, Alan Greenspan had died, deceased, sorry, one of the most famous economists in the United States. Alan Greenspan was actually the very first economist who began this kind of debt spending economy. So actually, before Alan Greenspan was the Fed chairman, the entire budget and also the national debt control was very rigorous. Never can the United States government imagine that borrowing debt or increasing national debt would be actually the way for spending. But after Alan Greenspan in 1990s, he developed a kind of financial theory. But okay, anyway, the basic idea was the United States economy was very elastic, and its economic resilience is going to make sure that globally the reliance on the US dollar for trade are still highly likely to be the most important thing. That is why, as long as the national debt, as long as the US dollar are still likely to be highly dependent on for international trade, which is actually about 40% in terms of the international trade and in terms of the contracts signed in the US dollar. So as long as that every country will necessitate certain part of the US dollar reserve, then every time the US government issue its dollar denominated bond, the national treasury bond, is highly likely to make sure that the US national sovereign bond is going to have very cheap yield, which means the borrowing cost for the United States government is also always likely to be pretty low. It was like about 5-year US Treasury bond is likely only to have 2% of the yield or interest rate. So which is making sure that the borrowing cost for the United States government is always likely to be pretty low as long as the international demand for the US dollar as a kind of reserve currency are still there. Um, So Alan Greenspan had developed this kind of theory. So ever starting in the 1990s of an ever increasing national debt for the United States. So currently we have seen the United States government sovereign debt have already been 70, almost 38 trillion dollars. It was something like 37.67 something. So it was almost $38 trillion, which is horrendously high, which also means that every year the borrowing cost for the US government is several thousand, it's about tens of millions of US dollars in terms of the interest rate paid because of this huge $38 trillion US debt. Have I made myself very clear about national debt and also about why corporate that sort of reform is highly likely to have certain kind of the impact? So if you have very 15% of the corporation taxation rate, it is good because it is attracting a lot of the global companies to be likely to be stationed in your country. But the United States is another story because US enjoy the most world leading financial markets like the US, the New York Stock Exchange and Wall Street being the world leading power. Before the UK's Brexit, we will still be able to see London as the second headquarter of financial center. But now the power and also the influence of London as financial center globally have actually waned and decreased a great deal. That is why the United States has become the de facto leading financial markets in the world. No other city and no other stock exchange would be able to be as massively powerful and also influential as Wall Street or as New York Stock Exchange. And a lot of the futures market and also the auction, the open market kind of scale of sale and auction of the bonds and the securities that we're also likely to see that New York is world leading and the United States is the leading financial power. That is why I do not think that United States government should cut its corporate taxation rate that much. But anyway, this has been the Democratic Party, this has been the Republican government's decision, and the Republican government is always likely to do things that are very good for large corporations, for rich people anyway. Okay, and then we have certain kind of national debt. And no, sorry, this has been, I think it's about 105 or something, or 103 something, and the US is about 1.4. Sorry for the wrong data. I do believe that because China this year have actually increased pretty significantly its national debt, and that is why China has, especially after pandemic, had increased its national debt. So I remember before China's national debt versus GDP was likely to be 72 something, 73% something. But now after the pandemic, we have seen over the years steadily increase, especially this year, the year 2025 and also in the year 2026, we have seen significant kind of increase of national debt because that China have actually been shifted toward a certain kind of different strategy that is trying to boost the domestic consumption. And this domestic consumption is actually led by the national subsidies. So there have been a lot of the national subsidies encouraging consumers to spend more in order to boost consumption economy. That is why that even if we have pretty good kind of economic data, I have read the economic report last week. So it is about the issuance of several. It's about several billions. No, it's about 30 billion. That sort of debt is actually triggering about $1 trillion of trade. So this is good strategy in order for consumption boosting, but in itself, it is slightly negative because it actually increased the national debt as well. But still, it is within ambit and also the control of the state because the national debt to GDP ratio is still likely to be below or approximately 100%, not as horrendously high as the United States or Japan or some other countries. The data of the German government is likely to be 80% something. So there are better economies like France and Germany, and Germany's national debt to GDP ratio was something like 80%, so much, much better than China. It is almost 100%. That is why any country that is enlarging its national debt, if it's anything that is exceeding 100%, it is quite dangerous, because this means that the nation would have to pay much higher interest rate, because the borrowing cost would be horrendously high anyway. That is why and endlessly inflating your national debt would be a bad strategy. Which is also true about the United States, that currently, before Trump's second administration, the U.S. national debt was about 36 trillion. That was at the end of the Biden administration. But recently, only about 2 to 3 years into the second administration of Donald Trump, we have seen that because this huge spending, especially the military defense spending, so the national debt has inflated almost 2 trillion. At the end of Trump administration, I do believe that maybe in two years time, that the national debt is likely to be inflated more than 2 trillion under his second administration. But anyway, currently the United States had huge incentive to try to make sure that many more countries are still likely to keep the US dollar as a kind of reserve currency, and the US would also have huge incentive to try to make sure that oil, especially the OPEC oil, were still likely to be traded only by the US dollar. But unluckily, there have been many things that were developing against the will of the United States. We have seen that in the recent 2 months, UAE, one of the previous oil OPEC exporting country member, have actually withdrawn from OPEC. And also now Saudi Arabia has become the de facto most powerful oil exporting country within OPEC, the second being Iraq. But Iraq is currently in war with the United States. I've checked the news that yesterday the war was still continuing even after the signing of the peace treaty. But it seems that ceasefire is never likely to be something near sight, because even after the signing of the formal treaty, that we are still seeing fire. A lot of the fighting were still ongoing, and because of the certain of the attack of the ships by the U.S. Army, and Iran had again counterattacked many of the military bases in the Middle East. So the war is still likely to be ongoing. Okay, one of the reasons that Iran is targeted at is partially, I'm not so sure this is 100% the reason. I'm not so sure about the assuredness or affirmity of how much this is actually accrued to the main reason for United States attacking Iran. There are other geopolitical reasons, like, for example, US would still want to have more absolute control in the Middle East region. Aside from Saudi Arabia has been loyal partner, and um, also is that Iraq, it has also at least also mainly following the puppet government in Iraq has also been following a lot of the instructions by the United States government. Iran probably is the only dissenting country that would have the gut or courage to rebel against the US. We're not talking about the long history dating from 1970s about the separation between Iran government and also the United States. We're only talking about that in the recent decade that Iran has mainly exporting its oil to China. And a lot of this oil is not actually traded against the US dollar. So it is directly using RMB and also Iran's currency for a kind of direct trade, bypassing the US dollar or the use of the US dollar against the mandate by the OPEC. That is why the United States government is quite angry, because this is actually dethroning US dollar as the leading currency and detract a lot of the necessity for the need of the dollar in terms of international trade. But this kind of thing is only partial of the reason that the US government is so antagonistic against the Iranian Iranian government. Okay, being said so, are there any questions that are related to what I have explained about these certain kind of the fundamental things related to fiscal policies? Okay, there are other economic policies like related to financial certain kind of the control and also real estate and the wealth distribution. It can, when any kind of policy related to wealth distribution, this is actually about progression taxation. It is actually about, for example, how much of a tax is likely to be levied by the government, especially against rich people. I think that overall, the most broader taxation rate to rich people beyond annualized income of $1 million would be approximately about 40%. 40% of the taxation rate against the rich people that have an annualized income beyond 1 million US dollars. Okay, referring to monetary policy, this is more likely to be some kind of the fiscal ideas about discount rate. It's actually about the borrowing rate between commercial companies within overnight of 1 week. And this discount rate is very closely related to the interest rate that is set by the central bank of every country. So this is likely to be every country's central bank decided an interest rate, and that interest rate is likely to be affecting discount rate. And a lot of these discount rate is likely to decide about the borrowing cost among commercial institutions, and that is likely to decide about the economic activity and also the liquidity. What we call liquidity means that how money flows and at what kind of speed or rate. And we also have reserve requirement ratio. This is basically certain kind of the policy decided by the central government, the central bank, that is targeted at all kinds of financial institutions, especially banks, about how much percentage of the money that you need to be reserved in a central bank. For example, we have one of the four leading financial banks or commercial banks that in a certain country, that when reserve requirement ratio is about 12% or 8%, this means that this kind of percentage of the cash has to be reserved in the central bank, which means that a lot of the cash flow are going to be maybe checked or decreased. This reserve requirement ratio is likely to become a kind of soft adjustment policy when the government wants to maybe reduce cash flow or dent certain kind of economic financial activities. A lot of the securities and also derivatives are sold in the open market. So we have a lot of open market operations. And also we have second tier security market where after IPOs, many of the stocks are likely to be exchanged in open market at the second tier security market, where many of the securities, for example, SpaceX, after its initiation, we seen that last month, is that last month or this month, that SpaceX have actually got its IPO. So right after its IPO, the stock prices have been horrendously higher. So Elon Musk has been again become a pretty rich man, and his personal asset is actually leading to more than 1 trillion US dollars. So he is the de facto richest person in the world, individually spoken, not corporate or collective asset, etc. So individually, he has been rich enough. But just a few days ago, SpaceX stocks have actually plummeted. It has been detracted about 1/3 of its value after increase immediately several days or week after its IPOs. But anyway, this kind of stock fluctuation does not actually detract the personal asset of Elon Musk, because he owned a lot of other company assets aside from SpaceX, he also had Tesla and many other companies, several other companies as well. And also he heavily invested in OpenAI, in the AI technology. AI bet has actually been the heated topic in today. And also at the beginning of January this year, so we have seen a pretty kind of exuberance in AI investment. So many AI companies have been investing heavily in this area. And we have seen NVIDIA has actually been pretty kind of a focus. And also we have OpenAI, Gemini, Claude. So many of the these AI companies have become the area for heavy bet. This is actually because that a lot of the corporations have found that they do not want to hire human workers, and they want to hire experienced workers who are actually assisted by several agents. These AI agents would be able to work faster and also at 10 times or at least um, 20 times or 30 times faster and more efficient than human beings. So it becomes a kind of era. Many of the leading tech companies, they want to dispose of human labor. They do not want to hire many people. They want to have more of an AI agent that is working under the mandate or the operation of a work of an employee. So we have seen at the beginning of this year that the blog have actually sacked or fired its 40% of its employee. We have seen several leading companies have a large kind of layoffs, including Meta and OpenAI, many of these leading tech giants. This is never this kind of layoff is never about company have not been profitable. Actually, a lot of these AI companies and leading tech companies have seen their revenue has been increasing historically high. The thing that they want to dispose of human labor is because they found the AI has been more efficient, and also you do not have all this kind of headache of have to dealing with people like severance pay, like a lot of the sick pay, and a lot of the pension package, etc. So dealing with human beings have become a kind of headache and a kind of trouble for many of the companies. That's why they want to dispose of humans. They want to have more AI. But the thing is, when so many companies are highly reliant upon this AI agent doing things, for example, Claude company has become the platform where many of the companies are heavily relying upon for leashing out their business operations. Therefore, whenever Claude had collapsed for maybe 1 second or only half a day, a lot of the data for the company will be jeopardized, and also the business's operation will also be jeopardized. That is why many companies, especially those highly efficient companies, are heavily relying upon AI, and also their token use have actually exponentially increased. But in the meantime, the electricity consumption has also been raised up pretty horrendously high. So this is a kind of basic estimates about in terms of proportion. For example, United States have actually been used about 45% of the AI electricity consumption, and China has been consumed about a quarter, which is 25%. And so which shows that to some degree, we have seen a lot of this electricity generation due to the AI usage, which also shows that United States is still become the leading company that have actually having a lot of the AI or offering a lot of the AI services or having a lot of the AI innovation, and also in terms of the AI development and advances. Okay, monetary policies. Okay, we have interest rate policy. We have already talked about interest rate policy. Okay, inflationary rate. Always remember that a 2% inflationary rate is a pretty good thing, because if economy does not inflate slightly, it is pretty bad, because this means that economic development is likely to be pretty slow, or it can be stagnant. That is why 0% inflationary rate or minus deflation will in itself become a kind of economic killer. That is why nobody wants to have any kind of deflation. They want to have inflation within about 2%, which is pretty ideal. But anything inflationary rate or inflationary pressures is increasing, that is a pretty bad thing. Anything go beyond the 3% could be kind of dangerous. Anything beyond the 4% is already kind of alarming level for inflationary pressures. Anything that is beyond the 5% means that central bank would have to heavily hike interest rate. Otherwise, the economy is likely to be destabilized. So last year, I believe several times that the US inflation rate has been horrendously high, passing 5%. It is the beginning of the year, the end of the year 2022, as a result of stimulus package during the pandemic and also at the beginning of the year 2023. These are the reason for Jerome Powell, the ex-Federal Reserve chairman, likely to have significant interest rate hike at higher frequency and also at a higher speed. It was like the 50 basis point of increase instead of only 25 basis point increase at each time. So these at the year 2023, we have seen the collapse of the small regional banks like Silicon Valley Bank and also Signature Bank. And also globally, this increase and the hiking of the interest rate have also actually resulted in many of the many of the appreciation of the United States dollar and also depreciation of many countries' currencies, which may include countries like Sri Lanka had basically collapsed and declared the bankruptcy because its foreign reserve have actually gone rampant due to this sharp increase of the US dollar and the depreciation of its own currency, which means that it has used up its foreign dollar reserve in purchasing of many imported goods like rice, like food, like oil, because fossil fuel is still the basic means for energy provision worldwide. Even if that globally we have seen an increase of green technology and the green energy, but the rate accustomed to energy generation, green technology is still less than 10%. In China, green energy provision probably is slightly beyond the 20%, which is pretty high. It is almost a 30%, I believe, but the entire proportion of traditional fossil fuel energy provision is still horrendously high, as 60 to 67%, or around approximately around the 7%. And China has already become the leading country that is also striking pretty forcefully into green technology. And India is another country, also horrendously try to empower its green sector. There have been a lot of green tech reverberation and also the government subsidizing in many of the green tech development like Econ, etc. But despite this kind of the government subsidies and also a lot of the preferential policies, but globally, fossil fuel is still the basic way or the larger proportion of energy provision. That is the reason that why a lot of the countries are still suffering negatively if oil prices increases so much. Okay, now we'll move on to basically about, so I've actually explained a lot deal of things that basic ideas that can actually be related to many of the analysis about things related to what can happen. And a lot of these are stock arguments or pieces of analysis related to stock arguments. These are the basic map of how economy has been run. Let's come to some of the basic ideas related to markets. These are also stock arguments as well. Okay, so we have seen here, these are all arguments about why markets are good places. You can also use pieces of these analysis whenever that you are talking about scale economy, whenever you are talking about motions related to, for example, do we want to have this business in private sector or do we want to have government run, etc. Let me show you the motion. So it can be, sorry. Let me try some motion. Okay, I hope the motion can be seen here. Let's try to see. There are some motions that can be related to whether market is a good place or not. Okay, so like this one is about stock market populism. So it is about how information are related and likely to be democratized and why private market is a good thing or let me go through this. Okay, it's also about this one. This house believes that the state should cap the amount of investment a single individual can make. It is actually about whether personal decision making or the government should intervene, whether the market is a good place for why market is a place with open information. And even if the market has open, transparent information, would the individual be able to understand or have expertise or certain kind of particular pieces of knowledge that would be able to facilitate them to make the right decision or not? And also about so this is actually related to environment, economy, and also environment. Okay, so this one. This house, as a green sector, would like to invest in climate startups in the developing country as opposed to those in the developed country. So this motion may also have some pieces of stock arguments that you can actually borrow. Okay, let's come to the slides. Okay, the first argument about markets are expression of freedom of choices is actually about every person would be able to find whatever they want in the market. That is why this kind of optimization of your best interest, whatever you want, and also exactly because of market competition. So companies are competing against each other to get the best quality. Therefore, the consumers are likely to enjoy best quality. So these are certain kind of the upside about free market. And second thing is about market has actually become a place where you'll be able to have transparent information. Exactly because that products have to be sold. And oftentimes, there have been a lot of information that is flowing in the market. You would be able to hire experts to be able to tell you what are the most accurate and the most applicable pieces of information. And before you are doing any trade, you're also likely to hire a professional team to try to do the market research about which company offer better services, offer better pricing. So that is why markets has become a place where transparent information would likely to be provided. That is why market is a good place for transparency, for more information. And also markets are depoliticized means that without any kind of political will, without any intervention from the government, that this pure competition are likely to have the best decision of whoever offers the cheapest prices with more quality products are likely to be oftentimes liked by the market. That is why a lot of the times that people would prioritize good markets and also likely sorry, and also would likely to be able to enjoy better services. That is why market competition is something pretty good, and also depoliticized markets are something pretty good, because without government intervention, because a lot of the times the government intervention is likely to be political decision. It can be bad decision. It can also be decisions that are most likely to be associated with certain kind of government agenda that may not actually work in the best interest of the market. And that is why a lot of the times the government decision may be lopsided, or it can be under the influence of lobbying, or it can also be representing certain entrenched interest groups' interest instead of the public interest, etc. That is why without the government intervention, markets are most depoliticized and would be the best places, making sure that all products are cheaply available. Also, scale economy in itself is a pretty good thing because many quality products are going to be offered at affordable pricing. And also, you can see that many of the market transactions can improve social welfare. And this social welfare doesn't mean that your welfare spending. It is actually meaning the well-being of individuals. Oftentimes, because of competition, that many companies are going to compete for the best innovation and to offer the affordable pricing to its products. Therefore, overall, the trickle-down effect is likely to be happening. Many of the products are likely always to have most advanced technologies while the pricing is cheaply available. That is why the smartphone technology is already quite pervasive in so almost every country, so you would be able to have enable almost every person to have a smartphone, and the smartphone in itself is quite convenient. It is going to facilitate your a lot of things, which also make sure that digitalization is happening in a wider scale. That is the improvement of social scale, of social welfare, when technology in itself has been boosted, and all of these are because of market transaction has been democratized. Okay, and the last advantage is about efficiency. Always likely that is the most convenient argument about the scale economy, about good companies, and also competition being good, because competition is going to make sure that the company who survive better are always likely to be the company who offer the best pricing, the most advanced technology, and also with the cheapest, with the highest return, and also with the cheapest production cost, etc. Okay, now we come to next slide about monetary supply. I think that you can read this about that a lot of the times that money supply means is the total value of the money available in the economy. This is liquidity as well. A lot of the times the money supply data is recorded and then published. It is done usually by the government or the central bank. So this is also a good thing, because a lot of the times that the market, the listed companies, they would have to report their financial statements on a seasonal basis, which means that every quarter, on a quarterly basis, which means every 3 months, that you are going to see a report of the balance sheet of these listed companies. And oftentimes the central government is obligated to publish a lot of data, like the economic indicators. So companies will be able to make right decisions based on the accurate knowledge of these economic indicators. But there are certain companies probably who are likely to hide information. The pretext or the reason being they do not want to create panic in the market. But aside from the government data, there will be other corporations and private institutions that are likely to issue accurate data. There are, for example, World Bank and many other leading financial institutions like Goldman Sachs, like Nomura Securities. So we have like Lloyd Bank, and also Barclay Bank, and so UBS, etc. We have many leading financial institutions. They have their own research branches. And these research office are likely to release quarterly analysis about the markets. A lot of the data issued by these financial institutions are likely to be very accurate, and that is why market transparency are still likely to be there, as long as you be able to read and understand how this data will indicate. Okay, that is about market information, even if the governments are likely to hide some information, but many of the private sector and institutions are still highly likely to publish the economic data and the indicators. I think, okay, I've already talked about that 2% inflation target. Okay, market failure. These are also very stock arguments about why market is a good thing, or why market is pretty good about I've already talked about why markets are good places. Then here comes to why markets are bad places. The very first reason is about inflation can be pretty bad. What have actually caused inflation? Not only because of economic growth, but also there are other reasons. For example, there can be war, there can be conflicts, there can be shortage of supply of certain materials, like oil supply have become short, or oil prices have actually been controlled by OPEC. So we have seen an increase of oil prices, or there can be other reasons for inflation, like for example, the government have issued too much money, so too much monetary supply have been pumped into the financial system. You will necessarily see a depreciation of the currency, because the purchasing power have been diluted by printing too much money, injecting too much money into the financial system, which will also cause inflation. So inflation can be a bad thing especially hyperinflation. But deflation can also be a bad thing as well, because, like, for example, starting from the 1990s, where Japan had suffered after the property bubble had bursted in Tokyo, we have seen Japan has been actually set into a kind of 2-decade-long deflation. It is after 2015 that we gradually see Japan's economy recovered slightly. But before 2015, even with Abenomics starting from 2012, we still haven't seen much of a progress of economic boom coming from Japan. So for almost 2 decades, ranging from the 1990s till 2010s, we are still likely to see a kind of deflationary cycle in Japan, which had actually been pretty threatening to the economies in Japan. Deflation is pretty bad when you also slightly see some kind of the inflation in terms of the raw material, then it is likely to be the stagnation. And the stagnation is going to be a horrible thing for many people, which means that production costs are increasing while prices are not increasing. Many factories have to declare bankruptcy because the products cannot be sold and prices cannot be increased while their production costs are climbing. And there are 5 leading failures in markets or 5 downside in markets. The first is monopoly. It is actually about large companies like MNCs or like certain kind of the state-owned enterprises that are actually monopolizing certain sector. For example, in China, we have 2 leading companies like Sinopec and these kind of oil companies are leading, so it is kind of having certain kind of monopoly, while globally we have seen many leading MNCs are dominating certain sectors. Monopoly can be a good story, can also be a bad story. For example, monopoly is pretty good at a scale economy. Therefore, it would be able to afford affordable pricing for certain kind of the market products. But monopoly can also be bad because it stifles many of the innovation. The incentive for many monopolies to try to innovate itself is quite low or relatively low. That is why monopoly is probably going to maybe stifle innovation or at least slow down innovation a bit. And also many of the monopolies can collude, try to have price gouging. This means that many leading monopolies are likely to collaborate with each other to increase prices because they do understand the market share for these companies collaborated are likely to be horrendously high, and that there are no other alternatives or no other affordable or nearby alternatives that people would be able to turn to. Therefore, price gouging among some monopolies within sector will happen. This is actually to the negative interest of the consumers. And then we also have externalities, which means that a lot of the time, this is partially related to collective action problem. But remember, not all externalities are bad. There are good externalities as well. For example, there will be what we call windfalls. These are good externalities, but also there are headwinds that those are bad externalities. For example, due to US-Iran war, the fossil fuel had increased that much. That is why a lot of Asian countries, especially ASEAN countries, are suffering from these inflationary pressures. That is why countries like Philippines, Thailand, and and Cambodia, they actually had a pretty bad time because the increase of the fossil fuel had actually consumed a lot of their foreign exchanges. That is why the negative externality is going to be created within the countries. These are the reason why Philippines and some of the ASEAN countries are actually suffering from higher inflationary rate, and also the government subsidy for energies is probably running dry because that oil prices have increased so much. So these have been the negative externalities due to the Iran war. And there could also be good externalities. So arguments can be about oil prices, as long as they're pretty high, it is good thing and good news for green technology. Because so far, green technology has already pretty mature. So especially wind power, solar, and a lot of these wind turbines and the solar panel have actually been cheaply available. The only thing is about infrastructure. So the government, especially developing government, would not have enough money to try to invest enough infrastructure. For example, the EV cars. So it is okay for individuals to buy electric vehicles, but it's not okay for the government to try to install a lot of the charging stations very widely in shopping malls, in the residential areas, and also in many of the neighborhoods. That is why, as long as oil will stay pretty high, as long as the geopolitical tension would still make sure that oil supply is going to be quite kind of urgent or conflicting, and this war are continuing to happening, or at least the higher frequency of many of the war and the conflicts happening, continuing to push oil prices pretty high, this will actually be pretty good for green energy development, because these will increase the likelihood for the government who want to invest more in green technology, because comparatively the cost for investment in green technology will sound or at least appear more attractive than less likely. Okay, collective action problem is actually related to environment. More likely, it is actually about when the entire market are how should I say, every company is polluting, every individual is polluting the environment, then the global warming is likely to be unstopped. So this is the collective action problem. But also, they are likely to become happening in market is like race to the bottom. So whenever we talk about race to the bottom, or the so-called good these bad products or substandard products are driving out or crowding out good products with higher prices. So it is all due to this collective action problem. Because when everybody who wants to buy cheaper goods without being able to distinguish quality products with relatively higher prices, then cheaper pricing products are likely to crowd out those kind of slightly more expensive products, but with better quality. This is exactly the case of race to the bottom, which is true for many companies. So the leading business model nowadays we have for many of the tech companies are exactly those kind of free service model. For example, ChatGPT offers you free services, and the DeepSeek, many of these tech companies like platforms are actually offering free services. But this kind of free service is contingent upon the fact that they will be able to galvanize from the data they collected from you. They would be able to monetize this data. Otherwise, there's no point of offering those free services. So many platforms are offering these services because they want to collect your data and you are enjoying their services. But in itself, the business model is kind of slightly problematic because it involves a kind of premises. For any company who want to stay profitable, the very first step is to offer free services without even thinking about profit margin at the onset of their business or at the initial stage of their business. Amazon has become an example in point. So Amazon have actually stayed in the red. The company has never earned money for more than 10 years, for almost 2 decades. That Amazon has not actually earned much for its investors. But suddenly you found that Amazon has become so influential, so profitable with many of the leading businesses that are earning money. But for the very first 15 years, the Amazon, the company, and also its investors have never ventured even to think about profitability. It is until after 15 years' time that investors of Amazon have seen horrendously high profit margin from many of its derivative businesses based on the data collected by Amazon or based on the base services that are provided by Amazon as a kind of trading platform. Okay, so the business cycle or the business model itself is quite kind of dangerous because a lot of the companies are actually replica this kind of business model, which means that for the first 10 years or a decade or more than 15 years, you do not even think about making profits. You just think about how to bundle yourself deeply and entwine your business into the lives and also the business, the corporate life of your clients. Whenever it becomes that their life and also their businesses becomes inseparable from your business, that from the services that you are offering, then it becomes the exact date where you'll be able to begin to monetize yourself. But this means that at least for the first 10 years, that a lot of investment has to be the sunken cost, which is highly contingent upon the success story that the company are likely to earn profit after 10 years. Not every company right from its onset investment would be able to imagine or for 100% sure that this company are likely to succeed, that there is going to be a profit margin after 10 years of investment. That is why this business cycle has been kind of copied by many new startups. Okay, so basically you will understand a lot of the negative side of this business model. But anyway, information asymmetry. So this is exactly opposite to what we call information transparency. It is actually about the buyer and also the service provider. Many of the buyer would be able not to see the entire information, while the service seller or the business provider would have the full knowledge of the information. Also, another analysis is actually about even if there are abundant information or pieces of articles or many things that are saturated in marketplace, but your ability to decipher those articles, to understand the pieces of information, or to try to sieve from an ocean of advices, of suggestions, of pieces of articles, of plenty of advice, your capacity to be able to find accurate information is another story. Not every person would be able to have accessibility of have capacity to be able to know what is the correct information or accurate information. This is what we mean by information asymmetry. And also, consumer irrationality is partially due to several reasons. First, these consumers want to buy more because they want to crave for more things. And the second is about a lot of the advertising is going to trap people into certain kind of attraction. And there are also likely to be the ego boosting, that many people in ego boosting are likely to be spending irrationally. And there has been a pretty kind of very immensely quite kind of shocking story recently in China about a girl who worked for her father. Her father was a very successful businessman, and the company were actually involved in a kind of wholesale business for pork and for a lot of meat. So oftentimes the company would necessitate huge cash flow, like millions of cash flow. The father the father was the business owner, and the daughter were a kind of get indulged in this kind of online influencer, what we call 打赏, which means that you will give tips to the influencers while broadcasting or in live streaming. And a lot of the times that the live streaming is predicated upon this kind of psychological game, where if you become the leading number one tip giver, that you're likely to get your personal ego to be boosted so much. And there is likely to be a billboard that you're likely to become the top one tip giver, that you feel so kind of emboldened about your being most powerful person, certain kind of the ego story thing. So this girl have actually spent more than 1 million. It's about, let me see. It's about 17 million, 17 million RMB in terms of tipping a lot of the online influencers. And she has been very influential and also quite kind of generous kind of tip giver in those live streaming circle. But anyway, his father's businesses have declared bankruptcy because of these huge tips that she had given away. So you see that a lot of consumer irrationality, especially in this kind of digitalized world, where especially and even Facebook have been widely criticized of a lot of platforms as well have been widely criticized, like TikTok, etc. Um, these short videos have actually been predicated upon human psychology desires, that the attraction and almost a certain kind of this resistance toward the, how shall I say, human desire that your have instantaneous gratification. You feel so psychologically satisfied about many of the things for consumption, for spending, for instantaneously gratifying your personal desires. Therefore, a lot of the consumer irrationality, and this is also true that that many people, after they have been indulged to TikTok short videos, it is hard for them to kick, and they're going to sit there in their couch browsing through video after video for hours. So these have become the irresistible model for many of the kids and even for adult as well. Okay, and some of the things about okay, this is actually another slide. Okay, this one. This one. This is pretty important about how corporate decisions are made, and different people are actually making decisions. What are about their individual incentive of doing business and also investment, etc. We'll see different echelon and also hierarchy for people working in companies. There are first board of directors. They are actually the owner or the shareholder or the leading shareholder of the company. These people are most likely to have envision. And they would have, of course, they will care about their monetary returns for their investment. They really care about how much the stock's worth. That is why they would want that the company stocks will continue to rise, which means that they are going to have more money. But also, they do care a lot about how this company are likely to be sustainable as well. And for chief officers, so these are CIO, CEO, CTO, etc., they do care about profit, their salary, because a lot of their salary are highly contingent upon how well they will be able to run the company. Many of these CFOs, CEOs, and also CTOs and CIOs, the stock bonus would be their an extra income. Especially when they are the leading management members within the corporation, they are likely to own certain proportion of the stocks. That is why their interests are also bundled with the corporate interest. This will make sure that they have greater incentive to try to increase the company standing, to boost the profit margin for the company, to make sure that the company is in healthy, and a lot of the long-term development for the company are also likely to be guaranteed. That is why this kind of leading management, they do care about profitability, but they also care about the legacy they would likely to leave. Tim Cook had recently resigned as the CEO. Then we have a new CEO, a leadership shuffle, and Tim Cook and the legacy left um, by them, because Tim Cook is LGBT. So the legacy left by them is certain kind of things that it is actually about manufacturing. It's actually about global supply chain. This kind of entrenchment, making sure that Apple would be able to instantaneously provide enough goods at equal amount of quality and also at equal speed globally. So these were certain kind of legacy that were unique under Tim Cook's rule. We're likely to see what is going to happen in the next leadership. But anyway, this leading management, they do care about not only money, but also they have a sense of vision, what kind of the legacy they will be able to create, certain kind of corporate culture or whatever they would be able to leave. Their way of management their way of leadership, etc. And we also have different levels of management where these people may have different monetary incentives. They also care about corporate advancement because they themselves are actually work very closely with many employees within the company. So this kind of emotional bondage to the company itself, like for example, the latest CEO of Apple has actually been working in the company for several decades. That's why have pretty kind of emotional bondage to Apple company as well. Then we also have normal employees. What are their incentive? They care about working conditions more while they care about money. They're also shareholders, but do not always believe that shareholders only care about money. A lot of the shareholders would also equally care about the longevity and the sustainability of the corporation. And the consumers, they not only care about products, they also care about the corporate culture. For example, Apple Watch has been bought by many people. The image of Apple, or what kind of the products, the quality of the Apple, and also the ideology represented by Apple, or the identity that you're using Apple products, what this identity may imply. So consumer loyalty may reside in many things. It is not only about the utility of the products they will be able to get. It may also be something likely to be related to vision, the image of a company, or certain kind of the corporate social responsibility, CSR, that is done by the company. So a lot of these will decide whether some consumers are likely to consume products offered by this company. Let me try to move on to some motion. So you'll be able to see why some of the motions are likely to use this page of arguments. I think that it is about, okay, it is this motion. This has been a very classic motion. So wages, oh, sorry. Can this be seen? So it is about wages should be determined by direct contribution of an employee, or the companies should be owned by employee. We do have certain kind of the new startups companies that are actually owned by individual workers for the company. For example, we'll see Elon Musk and also NVIDIA CEO Jensen Huang, and also we have a lot of startups. So the leading founder of that startup company may only be able to earn 5%. I believe for SpaceX, Elon Musk owned about 5 or 6%, and Jensen Huang owned about 6.5% of NVIDIA. So these are, even if you are the corporate founder, you only own a small proportion. And Jack Ma only owned 1% of Alibaba Group. So these are the new type of company that are owned by almost every worker. So in terms of the options, before the company have go public, so the options that are given to the individual workers, so will decide that this company is owned by almost every worker of the company. Huawei was previously also owned by its workers as well. So there have been certain kind of leading company or new type of companies that are actually owned by its workers. And therefore, it is never about the investors own larger chunk or proportion of the stocks. It is actually the company is collectively owned by all employees. About okay. Oh, this is about politics. Okay, let us shift back very quickly. Very briefly about global trade. So I'm going to talk about very briefly about certain kind of the common stock arguments related to global trade. These are applicable to almost every motion that is related to global trade, large developing countries, and also developed countries, and also the power asymmetry between the developed world and also the third world, about the small developing countries, etc. Okay, come to the free trade versus protection. There are stock arguments like comparative advantage. Every country would be able to export things they enjoy comparative advantage, and therefore they will be able to maybe have a greater deficit, a greater surplus in some of the products that they are exporting, and they would also be able to use this money to import something. Therefore, they will be able to have greater possibility for a surplus instead of end up in deficit. And for many leading industry, many emerging world and also developing countries have infant industries, and all these infant industries probably are less likely to withstand well, especially against the global MNCs. Many large multinational corporations, there are larger brands and very big brands. For example, we have um, in for example, in machinery, we have Caterpillar, and we have a lot of the leading machine brands, and also in pharma. In pharmaceutical companies, we have Pfizer, we have Johnson and Johnson. Many of these large MNCs and the global brands are pretty influential, and the quality products they offer are very good, pretty good. So they have landslide victory in terms of technology and also in certain kind of relative pricing as well. That is why many of these imported goods are likely to dump and also bought in large quantity in the developing countries where uh, this is also menacing to many of the infant industries in the developing world, especially countries like Cambodia. They do not even have their own mature industry. And Cambodia is a country that is just burgeoning with its industrialization. And some other countries, like, for example, Latin America countries, and South American countries, and some African countries. So if the market has been entirely open without any restriction at all, no, uh, not even tariff as a kind of wage or levy against foreign goods, then it is likely that a lot of the infant industries in the developing country are likely to be maybe simply stifled to death, and the products are less likely to be sold out compared to many of the foreign good brands. That is why this is what we call dumping. So dumping means that many of the goods are dumped in developing countries, maybe at relatively cheaper prices. And therefore, the market share for multinational corporations' goods are likely to be increasing. Many of the local industries and the brands are likely to decrease its market share. And many of the small developing countries are likely to be affected by economic shocks. These are usually like hot money inflow. So, for example, whenever the United States has zero interest rate, in terms of quantitative easing, whenever ECB lowered its interest rate, where a lot of these leading institutions are likely to borrow money at a cheaper rate, then they would be able to borrow money from this Western world and then try to invest in the developing world, where are likely to be emerging markets. Either it's Africa, South America, or Asia. Many of these emerging markets are likely to have an influx of hot money when economic are booming. Then in good times, when economic activities are booming, you have a huge influx of hot money. While that probably when the US, the Federal Reserve is hiking, or the bank are actually hiking its interest rates, then a lot of these hot money are likely to be flashed out. So you're going to see an escape of capital. So many of the capital flight are likely to be happening. This will cause a lot of the economic shocks in developing country, which means that the property prices are going to be dampened, and a lot of the currency flight, which are most likely to be the US dollar or etc., which means that many of the sectors in developing country are likely to be negatively affected. There are also some common arguments about the advantage of trade liberalism. So it is actually about every country would be able to utilize its best industry, its most advantageous sector, to be able to export things to its best advantage. Then the country would be able to get foreign reserve by trade, and will try to stay trade surplus as much as possible. You also have competitive effects because competition is always likely to bring about the best quality and the highest speed of innovation. So these are all good things about open up your market. You can also talk about the integration of global value chain. For example, Thailand, Vietnam are pretty good at production of rice. Therefore, many of the farm products are likely to be integrated into a global supply chain. So you would be able to buy Thailand rice and also Vietnam rice at many other places of the world, which is good because if you are selling rice domestically, either in Vietnam or in Thailand, due to Thailand currency and the Vietnam currency are pretty cheap. So the prices you are sold in domestic market is always likely to be pretty low. While you are selling globally, you are likely to maybe have a higher kind of profit margin because when you are sold in the US dollar or in other currency like a euro, this means that the same amount of rice are going to be sold maybe double or triple the prices. That is why integration into global value chain in itself can be a good thing for some of the developing, especially global south countries. And you also may have export-oriented FDI. Why FDI is likely to be happening? These are also common stock arguments. It is about you have cheap land, cheap labor in developing countries. This is third world, and also you have a lot of preferential policies for opening up. That is why many of the companies are likely to invest in your area, and a lot of the MNCs are going to have localized manufacturing business. Therefore, not only you're going to enjoy upskilling, like here is about beneficial trade-oriented policies and also upskilling for the local industrialization, but also these export-oriented FDI are also going to generate you have higher profit margin because of scale economy, because your country are likely to be maybe have a greater return ratio when you are having certain kind of FDI investment where many of the goods are manufactured and sold worldwide. Okay, the downside of opening the market or more cases for why country, especially developing countries, need to have protectionism. The first argument, stock argument, is about infant industry. I've already talked about that. And also FDI. Not all countries are actually developing FDI successfully. A great deal of the time, that FDI also means that the greater profit is likely to be taken by foreign companies instead of by the local companies. And also balance of payments is another issue. Many countries are going to run dry of its foreign reserve, like Sri Lanka, basically probably end up in bankruptcy. So cases like that are likely to be happening. You're going to have a lot of international monetary shock as well. So economy of scale by many leading Western global MNCs are more likely to be, for example, pretty negative to many of the leading economies in the developing world, because developing world are more often likely to suffer from lower rate of industrialization, maybe lower echelon of the technologies, and also pretty backward certain kind of the development in R&D, and also have been quite strained in terms of financial support, etc. So these are certain kind of the downside for opening up your economy. That is why a lot of the time you need to have less exposure to global economy shocks in order to protect many of your domestic sectors, especially the financial or the security, the stock exchange, etc., to be less likely to be shocked by many of these global markets, because a lot of the times that the open market size of Cambodia, Vietnam, it is much, much smaller. So one or five leading financial institutions would be able to kill these small-sized developing countries' security markets like Cambodia. So that is why opening up your market financially is likely to withstand a lot of the economic shocks. That is why it is bad. That is why protectionism, many of the regulations from the government, like for example, restrict number of foreign direct institutions that would be able to trade stocks and the deals are highly likely to be protecting your own economic development. And yes, about common currency, this is actually about euro. A lot of the cases for common currency, but many of the cases against the common currency as well. But common currency is less likely to be a leading topic now because most likely people already recognize that probably euro is the only common currency that would be able to have worldwide because there has once been kind of talk about Asia dollar, but likely this idea have already been outdated. People began to abandon the idea or applicability of an Asian dollar because the preconditions or the premises for common currency is you need to have a central bank, and also central bank is going to have a policy that is likely to be enacted almost every member state would have to follow assiduously, and also many of the member states would better to enjoy the same amount of economic development. If it is a kind of combination of faster developing economy with pretty slow developing economy or advanced economy in combination with maybe less developed economies, then there are likely to be many of the disparity, and this kind of disparity and of imbalance is going to create a lot of issues within this trading bloc. That is why common currency like euro probably could be the only example that can be conducted half successfully and half negatively within the economic trading bloc. Okay, that is all I want to talk about in terms of economy. Do you have any questions? Because this is a kind of too complicated issue, and I'm not so sure I would be able to explain myself so clearly in about, yes, just about 1.5 hours.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
In very beginning, you talked about the economy of scale and how it affects the globalized supply chain. Can you bit engage in that? Like I didn't got the point of the economy of scale, what that is actually.
So it is about global supply chain. Okay. Um, a lot of MNCs would be able to propagate its business globally is because that it will be able to get the cheapest production cost in almost every corner of the world. Then they are likely, for example, and this is exactly, let me try to cite an example about KFC. So KFC had many chicken farms in Asian countries, and it is chicken farm in the mountainous area, coastal area of China, and also in Indonesia and Malaysia. So a lot of these chicken farms would be able to generate or produce very cheap chicken, while KFC are going to slaughter the chicken in the chicken factory and then to refrigerate this chicken and then try to ship the chicken back to the United States and the other parts of the world. Therefore, globally, KFC would be able to make sure its production of chicken is always located in places where there are cheap labor, enough good equipment, and also the production cost for the growth of the chicken is always likely to be of the most efficient investment versus turnout investment and return rate, which means KFC is never going to grow chicken in the United States or in Europe, in European countries, because labor costs there are quite expensive, because land and also resources costs there are quite expensive. It is always likely to be produce chickens in chicken farms that are located in less developed areas where it is making sure that production costs are the cheapest. And the KFC would be able to do that. It is because globally it has several research R&D centers. It's going to make sure that this chicken is going to be grow in certain way, so the growth of the chicken is going to be pretty fast. And also the chicken feed, the mixture of the chicken feed is likely to be administered in certain ways. And this chicken feed, the recipe is going to be used globally, or at least in several regions, there is an R&D center, because you also have to consider about temperature, the weather patterns of the region, and also many other geographical circumstances and the conditions. So across KFC, there are maybe, for example, 5 or 6 research centers, and these 5 research centers are going to generate enough technology that would suffice all kinds of chicken farm use in the region or in several regions. Then this means that KFC is always trying to make sure it has the leading technology, and these R&D are going to be shared to many of these outreach of KFC, making sure that it is always crispy in terms of its fried chicken, and also in the taste of its hamburger, and in a lot of the chicken products it offered. And then the KFC products are offered and also provided in large quantity in leading countries and economies, and also in the first tier city, or in some of the, at least the most highly developed cities in some of the emerging markets as well. Therefore, chicken prices of KFC would be make sure that it is globally relatively higher versus its production cost. This is what we mean by scale economy. This means that several implications. First, many of the poor countries would be able to have its chicken farm to be linked to global MNCs. This means relatively versus global chicken products, these chicken farm are going to earn slightly higher profit margin versus chicken are local grown and also to be sold in local brands, because always likely that compared to KFC pricing, like for example a remote region in an Indonesian village, the chicken is going to be sold maybe only 20% of the pricing that KFC would be able to buy from this chicken farm. So the local producers earn more because they are attached or associated to KFC, while KFC itself would be able to relatively make sure that this chicken production is always likely to be globally the cheapest pricing, because it has a lot of production centers across the less developed areas, making sure there are enough equipment, relatively advanced technology, and also try to make sure the quality of the chicken farm production is likely to be the equitable level, or at least the equally acceptable level. That is why KFC is also earning money, because it is never going to have chicken farm in countries where production are really costly, and also production are really costly, and labor costs are pretty high. Is that clear now?
Yeah. Thank you so much for engaging in it. Thank you so much.
Okay, thank you. Are there any other questions?
Yeah, in certain debates, I've seen like, IPOs rolling out and speculative marketing, etc., but never really understood those. Could you please elaborate on how IPOs are run in debates and how speculative marketing and stock holding run in debates?
So this is about IPO. I in speculative markets. Let me show you this slide about why people are wanting to have IPOs. It's about IPO. Okay. We have two kinds of companies. One is public companies, and also the other is non-public companies. These are all companies that belong to private sector. This is not about state-owned enterprises. We are not talking about SOEs. We're only talking about companies, private companies. So one is public, which means that are listed. The other are non-public, which means that are not listed. This means that we have many companies like Deloitte. This is one of the four leading um, consultancy firms that are never listed because Deloitte have actually got involved in many of the backdoor dealings that are assisting many of the corrupted African government because auditing is necessary step for any kind of the government to be able to receive international aid or funding, or a lot of the governments, and it would have maybe certain kind of fund, development fund. But many corruptions means that this government are going to embezzle money out of that development fund. But in order to allow the company would be able to expand and attract the funding, the company may need to have an outside auditing, and Deloitte is oftentimes offering the services. That is why Deloitte are one of the companies that will never go public. Because going public means if you become public companies, which means listed companies, it's obligatory for you to try to offer and issue quarterly earnings. What is included in these quarterly earnings? It may involve the data you're spending money, your balance sheet, how much money you spent for how long time, and where have you actually invested. So this will also show the company strategy for investment, at least for short period of time, or there will be some long-term investment strategy, etc. But anyway, quarterly earnings are going to show where money are going to be where money have been spent and in what areas. A lot of the time, public companies will lose its first mover advantage. It is because that when your balance sheet is out, then it becomes imminently transparent for every other company to be able to see where you are investing. Then a lot of the areas probably are going to be catered to immediately by many other companies that are likely to compete. Then why people would want to have IPOs? What are the advantages of IPOs? First is about to get money. This IPO is going to be increasing a lot of the investment immediately. For example, any kind of the company that are selling its stock prices, maybe there is always likely before listing, the company would have to ask for advice from the securities. So every country will have its own security board or institution or bureau to try to galvanize, to try to have an overhaul of the company, making sure that their finance statement and also their IPO materials are actually transparently good, and also there are no lies, etc. But anyway, so this has been the appraisal processing for the security board or the bureau. Then after all these due diligence has been done, then the company will go list. The first advantage is about capital expansion. Immediately, company would be able to get a lot of money for investment. And this is good because this is going to either expand the existing business structure, or you will have more money to try to invest in R&D. And if you find that your core business may probably have a very profitable bifurcation, then you would also likely to diversify itself. For example, Google. Right at the beginning, Google was only a search engine company. But now we have seen Alphabet has been diversified in so many areas, and the AI tool has actually become one of the now leading product for Google, or the company Alphabet, the parent company Alphabet. So if you have more money, you'll be able to have a lot of these possibilities. Then alongside aligning material interest with profit is also something pretty good. Why? Because many of your stocks will be owned by the company CEOs, CFOs, CIOs, this leading management, and even some of the top management as well. So the managers, the senior managers, as long as they own the company stock, this would be a pretty good way for them to try to have their bonuses. If they are working for the company to the best interest, and most of the leaders within for the company are likely to last for at least 5 to 8 years. It is unlikely to be a short-term tenure for any kind of the senior managers. As long as to have stability of the company in terms of the strategy and the development, many companies are likely to have a leader or top management for about 5 years at least to ensure certain kind of stability. So to make sure that these company stocks are likely to be profitable for sustainable period of time, you are also increasing possibility for the top management to be able to have good incentive to operate the company is in its long-term interest. So that is why to have stocks and shares as a kind of bonus to the top administration would also become a pretty good thing, because which means you have good leaders who are likely to work for the long-term benefit. And also, these minimum shareholding requirements, like for example, if you are the CEO of the company and you can hold a certain kind of the shares for a certain kind of period of time, will also make sure that your basic interest as a top management is also guaranteed. Which means that as long as you are the leaders of the company, you're likely to work for the well-being or the long-term interest of the company. That is why stocks are good and owning stocks are good for some people. What is the downside of IPO? Why Huawei refused to have IPO despite its huge profitability? One thing is for sure that the Chinese government is actually supporting it when it is running short of money. But the other incentive for Huawei not to want to go public is the downside of IPO. The first is about the losses for control. A lot of the time, the decision making of what area to invest, of what products to try to develop or to focus or to prioritize, in what kind of subsidiary company you want to earn, you want to buy and to acquire. This means that acquisition. With what company you want to have merger. So we have all this time, this kind of Time Warner and Discovery Channel, that sort of merger. So if you own the leading percentage and a proportion of the stocks of the company, you're likely to have a control of the decision making of all these important crucial area for investment, for product development, and even for corporate culture. But if you lose control, probably you're less likely to function pretty well in terms of the board of directors. You're likely to not be able to have the voting right or the decisive voting right. Then it can also, the company can fall into the target of some hostile takeover. Many companies have actually become the target for hostile takeover. Even Facebook, at certain stage of development, is dangerously fall into the trap, almost fall into the trap of become a takeover target. But luckily that Zuckerberg had stayed unscathed. It's simply because that Facebook has been too expensive to acquire at those times. So hostile takeover can be another issue and a problem. So usually how hostile is done, it is likely like certain kind of the potential owners or who have large chunks of cash, who are likely to spread the rumors about the company or reveal bad information, or to try to tell people the company is unstabilized due to some certain fact or wrong decision making, or for a short period of time the company may run out of cash flow or bad things. But anyway, then the stock prices are going to be dampened so much. It will make it easier for this takeover for people who are buying stocks in the open market. And as long as there are increasing shares of stocks being owned by certain investor or several investors collaborating, then this would become hostile takeover. Then the company decision making are likely to be controlled or likely to be the decision making are likely to be shifted to some of other outsiders who are probably having more shares. Okay, what was the question again? About hostile takeover or about what kind of market? Speculative market?
Yeah, the question was about how IPOs work and how speculative markets work. Nothing much. Yeah.
Okay, how speculative market work? A lot of the companies, especially it is a kind of growth company. Why it is called a growth company? Just like, for example, Amazon. In the first decade of Amazon, the company have never earned profit, but people have faith on Amazon of being the leading tech company. About a lot of the good stories Amazon talked about itself, why it has huge potentials, in what area that Amazon is acquiring or investing. Therefore, its investors are still having faith. And that is why the IPO for Amazon have lasted for several phases. It can be phase 1 IPO, phase 2 IPO, and even phase 6 or phase 8 IPO. This means that whenever the company is short of cash, whenever the company will need a huge chunk of injection of investment, then they are going to go IPO. Then there will be investors who are likely to invest, and they are going to own shares as well. So this will mean that dilution of the shares by the original owner. But anyway, it is a collective decision because otherwise the company are going to declare bankrupt if there's no further continued injection of investment. When you're talking about speculative IPO, I think it is basically about this kind of hostile takeover. It is actually about whenever there be a potential buyer who want to own the company, or there are speculations of what we call this short-term trading. We have not only short, most of the, if you have faith in the company, you're likely to long. Long means you're going to invest for a long period of time. You are also very positive about the growth of the company. Therefore, you believe the stock prices are going to increase. When you want to short the company, which means that you do not believe the company are going to fare well, at least for the short term. For example, at the beginning of the year, where there have been two voices. One, partial of the investors think that NVIDIA has a huge financial issue, that Jensen Huang is bragging about too much. They're likely to become, maybe there will be something beneath the curtain, or there's something beneath the carpet that maybe the NVIDIA probably unlikely to continue its high profitability. So there is one bunch of voices. The other bunch of voices are pretty strongly supporting about NVIDIA still having huge potential of growth. Therefore, Jensen Huang would still be able to continue its miracle of high profitability for NVIDIA. But afterwards, people began to see something that is curious. That is, OpenAI and several other leading investors are actually buying chips from NVIDIA. And that kind of company were actually invested, if you are careful enough, are actually Jensen Huang's other company. So it has become certain kind of curious story of NVIDIA buying its own chips, if we could interpret it in that way. But anyway, those were the speculative moment. Some people do not believe into the story of NVIDIA is going to continue its huge profit margin because of the AI explosive development. Therefore, there are speculative bets within the market. We have seen certain kind of the sell-offs in the New York Stock Exchange. So these are certain kind of the speculative moments for trade. But then afterwards, very quickly, in March and also in April, people began to see, okay, never mind. The Jensen Huang indeed has proven, even if we understand that this deal could become a kind of Jensen Huang taking out of money from his one pocket and put that money into his other pocket. But anyway, the AI bubble will not burst. So people are still very solid about this AI growth because token and many leading companies are still heavily reliant upon this AI, how should I say, capacity in order to function well. So this is the exact moment where many of the speculation have actually waned. Therefore, market continue to long NVIDIA. Did I explain your question?
Yes, thank you so much.
Okay, are there any other questions? Thank you so much for your interest, and this has been quite kind of long lecture because it is so complicated and it has been full of a lot of the jargons and also very complicated things related to economy.
Thank you so much, Daisy, for hosting this workshop for us. It was really an insightful session. We'll actually put the recording of it live as well on YouTube so that people can go through it time and again to keep learning from the same. Thank you so much for taking in the Q&A session as well. It was really amazing to host you here. Thanks a lot once again. Thank you everyone for joining in.